Good morning, everyone. Today we finally get to expand our point of view about what was going on in the 16th century and look at Elizabeth's arch-nemesis, the Prudent King, the king of almost everything and the inventor of the expression, "the sun never sets on the Spanish Empire." Technically, he did not invent it, but it was dedicated to him, so that counts. So, buckle up as we abandon the dark English moors for the sunny lands of Spain, Italy, Portugal and most of America, asking ourselves why couldn't Elizabeth just ignore Philip II? In particular, we'll tackle the following point: Philip as a Catholic monarch, Philip as a world ruler, Philip as a guy with a strange interest in England and its queens. So, starting with the Catholic monarch. Now, before we actually start, we need to understand the extent of Philip's possessions. His father, Emperor Charles V, had essentially been genetically engineered to be the king of almost everything, except for France. He was the only Roman emperor, and in this capacity he ruled over Austria, Germany and Bohemia, and the king of Spain. He had also wrested Italy from the French. Northern Italy and southern Italy and most states in the center were his vassals in one capacity or another. And he was also the Duke of Burgundy, which ruled in this capacity over what are now the Netherlands and Belgium. Now, he abdicated, he left his throne in 1559 and left his imperial office to his brother, Ferdinand of Habsburg. But he gave pretty much everything else outside of Germany and Austria to his firstborn son, Philip, who expanded his domains even further by conquering Portugal and by sponsoring a further wave of conquests in South America. Now, it is extremely important to remember that Philip was Catholic. We said many times, that religion in the 16th century was essentially indistinguishable from politics. Being a part of a religious confession, of a religious denomination like Catholic, Protestant, Calvinist, Lutheran, Anglican or whatever, was like, in today's terms, being part of a giant international political movement. And it was much easier to be loyal more to the cause of your religion than to your own king or queen. So there was an international Catholic movement in which more or less all people had a common cause, which was very divided inside, but still had a generic commonality of goals. There was an international Reformed and Protestant movement, which had the same characteristics. People inside it fought each other a lot, but when it came to make a common front against the Catholics, they did it almost immediately. So, we should also remember that in the second half of the 16th century, the Catholic Church was trying its best to fight back against the rise of Protestantism, in what is generally known as either the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. I prefer the first one, the Catholic Reformation, because essentially the Catholic Church also started reforming itself, not just as a reaction to the Protestants. This was a movement which rebuilt and strengthened the Catholic Church worldwide, giving it the means it needed to keep the Protestant tide at bay. More control, more repression, more power given to the state and the Church. One way the Church, the Catholic Church, because now, remember, there are several churches. One way the Catholic Church was fighting back was by sending missionaries all around the world in order to save the souls of the many newly discovered peoples in Africa or in Asia or America before the Protestants could get their little heretic hands over them. And this is the reason why most South Americans and Filipinos today profess the Catholic faith. But there was also an open antagonism against all Protestant groups and rulers, those who had refused to remain part of the Catholic club. This could take the form of sectarian violence, violence between religious groups, as it was going on in France and later in the Netherlands, or it could take the shape of a tightly knit network of surveillance and repression of religious dissent at every level, as it was happening in most Italian cities, except Venice, because Venice was doing its own thing. Now, since Philip II was by far the most powerful Catholic ruler in the world, because France was at this time essentially paralyzed by the religious wars of the 16th century, since he was by far the most powerful Catholic ruler, he felt a deep religious duty to fight for the Catholic cause as the defender of the faith. This led him to antagonize Queen Elizabeth and other Protestant rulers and characters, especially in the Netherlands. We will see tomorrow or in this week why the Netherlands were such a huge problem for Philip II. It's actually one of my favorite rebellions in history, the Dutch Revolt. Still, this led him to this fact that he was the defender of the Catholic faith, led him to antagonize Queen Elizabeth with more or less open acts of hostility. We have studied already the numerous plots he supported, Throckmorton, Ridolfi, Babington plot, and so on and so forth. And also we know that he openly endorsed Mary, Queen of Scots, as the replacement for Elizabeth. This development were, of course, rather stressful for Elizabeth, who had already had a hard time building up her legitimacy as the Protestant successor of Henry VIII, only to see her rule threatened by Catholics born outside and inside her kingdom. Remember, loyalty to a religious cause often came before loyalty to one's king and country. So Philip's constant threats, which needs to be said, were paralleled by Elizabeth's own involvement in Philip's Protestant provinces in the Netherlands. So now we're talking about Philip plotting to overthrow Elizabeth, but Elizabeth was doing something very similar to overthrow or at least encourage the Protestant rebellion in the Netherlands. So these developments were clearly very worrying for Elizabeth. Now let's look at Philip as a world ruler and what it meant for the Queen of England. The sun never sets on the Spanish Empire, says an old proverb, and this is not just because God doesn't trust a Spaniard in the dark. I can say that because I am 16th Spanish. But also because Spain controlled a huge empire in America, Asia and Africa. The Philippines, for example, are named after Philip himself. They were conquered, I wouldn't say discovered, they were conquered by the Spaniards, who named them after the king. And they are located on the far east side of Asia. Philip also obtained the entirety of Portugal's growing colonial empire in South America and in the Far East when he forced a personal union on Portugal. Finally, during the Italian Wars of the 1500s, another incredibly interesting and complicated episode in history, which you should also read about, then forget about because it's too complicated, and then read again when you're older. Now, during the Italian Wars of the 1500s, his father Charles V had been able to snatch the rich areas of northern and southern Italy from France and had consolidated his hold on the wealthy provinces of the Netherlands. This was important not just because of the prestige that came with being the ruler of a world empire, of one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, but also because those territories were rich. Simply. Either, like South America, they produced huge quantities of precious metals, which tended to cause inflation in the long term, but they didn't know about it yet, or, like Italy and the Netherlands, because these areas were very highly urbanized regions with a lot of cities that controlled a large part of Europe's trade. Sure, despite this immense wealth, the Spaniards tended to bite more than they could chew, and they expanded their army to unprecedented extents. They are, in a way, the inventors of the modern European standing army, because they had money to pay people even when they were not fighting, which was not something normal at the time. And also because this eventually led Philip to declare bankruptcy 5 times. But despite this, the Spanish Empire still remained the wealthiest empire in the world by a wide margin, at least in the European world. If we start looking at the Ottomans, at China and at Mughals, then it's a whole different thing. Let's remain in Europe. Now, some of the territories he owned, like the Netherlands, were also very geographically close to Elizabeth. You could essentially drive a boat from Britain to Belgium, and Belgium was part of the Spanish Netherlands. Interesting fact, Belgium is mostly Catholic today, while the Netherlands are mostly Protestant today. This is because during the Dutch Revolt, Spain was able to keep control of the areas that are now Belgium. This is why they remained Catholic. So, some of the territories Philip owned, like the Netherlands, are only a few miles of sea away from England. Clearly, with all this in mind, Elizabeth could not ignore such a huge and hugely powerful neighbor, which was separated from her just by a tiny strip of salted water. And now let's look at Philip's strange interest in England and its queens. Now, it might be a bit difficult to explain, since why would a monarch with so much power and so much land be interested in a relatively secondary and faraway country such as England, which was neither particularly rich nor particularly influential yet? Now, the answer can be found in Philip's strategic plan to weaken his traditional enemy, France. By the time of Philip's coronation in 1556, Spain and France had been fighting for supremacy over the European continent for almost 6 decades, since the beginning of the Italian Wars in 1494. In this context, England's historically troubled relationship with France made it a natural ally of Spain. The alliance between England and Spain had already brought fruit at the time of Henry VIII. Remember? Fat bloke, many wives, changed religion, Henry VIII. That Henry VIII. At the time of Henry VIII, several English attempts at invading France were made, and they were very useful for Charles V to distract the French army and make the conquest and easily conquer northern and southern Italy. This relationship began to waver and became more uncertain after Henry VIII decided to cut his ties with Rome. And for a while, England looked like it could become the next big enemy in Philip's list, especially due to its proximity with the Spanish Netherlands. However, the traditional alliance was restored when Philip married Bloody Mary. Again, think about it, Bloody Mary was the daughter of a Spanish princess. Philip was the king of Spain. They were cousins. But that was again traditional for almost every ruling house in Europe, and in particular for the Habsburg, and would lead to some absurdly pointy chins. There is a picture in the transcript of the happy couple. Philip essentially treated England as some sort of puppet state in a way during his marriage with Mary. He convinced Mary to invade France, a war which was incredibly expensive and ended in disaster for England. Not for Spain, because again it was able to use the distraction provided by the English armies to beat the French and confirm its supremacy over most of Europe. In 1559, after Mary's eventual childless and very sad death, Philip sent a marriage proposal to Elizabeth, who kindly rejected him because he was concerned, reasonably, that Philip would keep using her as he had used his sister, as a pawn in his struggle against France, or as a pawn in his Catholic crusade against the Protestants. And this was true in a way. Philip saw England as a pillar in his strategy against France, in his strategy for domination over Europe, and for this reason he would just not give up trying to control the country. He saw it, reasonably again, as an incredibly useful strategic asset that could be controlled to further the interest of the Spanish Empire, and to that end he tried to gain control of the country using whatever means he had at his disposal. Wedding plots and even several invasion attempts after 1588. Unfortunately for him, and possibly fortunately for Britain, it never worked. So, answer this question, why couldn't Elizabeth just ignore Philip II? I'm looking forward to read what you're going to write, and see you next time.